Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia are called out. And then a little bit lower on, you have what is known as French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa. So a large swath of the African continent is controlled by France in this period. So a month before the opening attack at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, it's interesting to note that nearly half of the men who wore a French uniform came from one of these French African colonies. And the majority of these men were Muslim, and that's important too. Now, wary of instituting a draft in metropolitan France in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, Paris resorted to raising a volunteer army and drew on France's past experiences recruiting colonial soldiers to fight in the world wars. Unlike those wars, however, the war in Indochina would be the first time colonial subjects would be sent to fight other colonial subjects during a war for independence. And as we saw just at the very beginning, these men made up a significant portion of losses and casualties. Now, this number of casualties or losses is actually very imprecise because it factors in a bunch of different things, not just men who are killed in action, but deaths from disease, other casualties like injuries. But this number also includes those who would abandon the French army for the enemy during the war. Essentially people who deserted and joined the other side. A small but important set of soldiers who will be actually the main focus of today's talk. So on the one hand, the mobilization of soldiers from France's colonies in North and Sub-Saharan Africa represented a potent symbol of the post-war French Empire's ability to command the loyalty of its colonial subjects during its first major war of decolonization. And this is important because I think we often, in a more general narrative of decolonization, tend to think that after the Second World War, the European colonial powers, and France in particular, is kind of done, right? It's just a matter of time before the empire collapses, and the wars in Indochina and later in Algeria are considered kind of symptomatic of this. Yet, what I think, to kind of look at that a different way, the fact that France hangs on so long, commits so many men and so many resources for so many years, and can transport these men halfway across the globe and kind of sustain military operations. In the case of Indochina, certainly with US financial support, but in Algeria, that's not the case necessarily. Actually, I think goes to say that the French Empire is not on it's not this last gasp of empire that we're witnessing, but actually kind of an empire striking back, as it were. And so that's, I think, something to realize when we actually are trying to contextualize the use of soldiers from France's colonies in this conflict. Although they do represent the symbol of power, they also represented an ever-present anxiety for French military officials who worried about desertion and defection and feared that disaffected African veterans influenced by enemy propaganda, which we'll see in just a moment, would join anti-colonial movements in other parts of the French Union following demobilization. Similarly, Vietnamese communists perceived Africans serving in French uniform as both a threat to its own rhetoric of anti-colonial solidarity and an opportunity to spread propaganda aimed at widening rifts in the colonial military. So the focus of today's talk is actually going to be on the efforts of Vietnamese communists to persuade France's African soldiers to join their side, and not only trace the fate of those soldiers who did defect, but also what DRV cadres thought about the Black and brown soldiers that they interacted with. Over the course of the war, more than 300 African soldiers defected, and many of these stayed in North Vietnam after Vietnam's partition along the 17th parallel. Many would stay up until the 1960s. These migrants, for lack of a better word perhaps, to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam were welcomed as Người Việt Nam Moi, or New Vietnamese People. And they represented the potential for a post-colonial future marked by the promise of global revolutionary collaboration. But as we'll see, DRV officials often reverted to racialized ways of thinking in their interactions with African soldiers, which maybe did not differ much from those of French colonial administrators in the past. Moreover, tensions ran high as those Africans who did defect demanded more autonomy and freedom within North Vietnamese society. As DRV cadres, initially eager for France's non-white colonial troops to join their ranks for propaganda purposes, became increasingly anxious about the presence of Arab and Black men in Vietnamese communist society. And we'll see sort of the repercussions of that a little bit. But first, let me turn to these propaganda efforts. That the Democratic Republic of Vietnam would target France's colonial soldiers is not surprising. What is notable, however, is how central this project was to the overall war effort. The DRV implemented its psychological warfare program from the very beginning of the conflict, known as Dik Van, or rallying the enemy. That's how I would translate it. It might be something more akin to kind of pulling the enemy. Some other historians who have worked on this have translated as proselytizing to the enemy. I like rallying because there's a sense of movement to this idea, and that was actually really central to the whole point, which was to get these soldiers to abandon the fight, recognize the righteousness of the Viet Minh's cause, and join their side. Oh, and let me go back just for a second. We have here, I'll point out, covers of training manuals, essentially how to do Dik Van. And these were made mainly for cadres in the field to use. And it's from these kinds of sources that I've drawn a lot of this material from, in which they kind of explain the purpose of Dik Van, but also, most importantly, understanding the enemy that they need to kind of propagandize to. So it was hoped that these efforts would sap the French of morale and manpower. In the words of one training manual, Dik Van could be, quote, as powerful as heavy artillery and bazookas, unquote, if used correctly. And although Dik Van was aimed at all of those who served in the French Expeditionary Corps, and it's worth noting here that it was a very diverse fighting force. Obviously, there were white soldiers from metropolitan France, but there were also many soldiers from the French Foreign Legion. And these came from many different places, mainly from other European countries, and a sizable portion, soldiers of the former Wehrmacht, or the German army during the Third Reich, who more or less needed to hide out after the war, and decided that joining the French Foreign Legion, no questions asked, not a bad deal after 1945. And although all of these soldiers are certainly the target of these Dik Van efforts, African soldiers received special attention because they represented a pool of future rebels who could be trained and eventually sent back to their homelands to fight for their own national liberation. The deserters of today might be the revolutionaries of tomorrow, or at least that's the hope. Dik Van propaganda efforts relied heavily on the printed and spoken word. Leaflets, posters, and slogans shouted through megaphones across the battlefront. The content of these communications were often tailored to the particular kinds of soldiers that Vietnamese communists hoped to persuade, translating propaganda into French, German, and Arabic, and altering the content of the message to address different audiences. And as you can see here on the screen, I've got sort of two artifacts of Dik Van. On the left is a phrase book, actually, of phrases that you might be able to shout to the enemy. These phrases are transliterated phonetically in Arabic. So to allow a Vietnamese cadre who obviously does not know how to speak Arabic would be able to sort of make do best they can and say, very important phrases like, we'll zoom in just a second so you can see, but, listen, raise your hands, don't fear us, shoot the French colonialist, these kinds of very important operative phrases. On the right-hand side, we have a reproduction of a leaflet that's addressed to North African soldiers, although the content of the message is mainly aimed at Moroccan soldiers, but it's more or less calling out this sort of central idea that you are a colonized people. You should not be fighting a colonized people. You should not be shedding your blood in the effort of the French colonialists. So come and lower your weapons and join our side. This fight is useless to you. Let's zoom in just to give you a flavor of some of this propaganda, just to the phrase book itself. And again, as you can see here, this is very likely dialectical Arabic from either the western part of Algeria or Morocco. And what this actually shows is that they would have very likely a deserter, in this case, perhaps an Algerian or a Moroccan, who actually worked with them to translate these phrases into phonetic Arabic for a Vietnamese person to say. And yes, you can, if for those of you who can read French, you can kind of see the translations here about lowering your weapons and shooting the French and all that kinds of things. Now, effectively communicating, however, went beyond just knowing how to say certain catchphrases and slogans in, say, the target language. It also required cadres to understand the enemy that they were fighting. African soldiers, therefore, featured prominently in some of the earliest training material. Training manuals and internal reports give us a glimpse into how Vietnamese communists imagined African soldiers and how they inscribed them into the larger ideological framework of their struggle. So Vietnamese communists divided their adversary into kind of four broad categories. You had your French soldiers, Linh Thap, your German soldiers of the Foreign Legion, Linh Duc, and that just goes to show you that in their minds, all Foreign Legion soldiers were German, even though that wasn't the case. There were people coming from all over the world. You have Black Westerner soldiers from Africa, or Linh Tay Den. And then, of course, puppet troops, Nguy Binh, who are those Vietnamese either professionally trained or auxiliaries who are fighting with the French. Now, the term Black Westerner here should probably be interpreted as a reference to the dark skin of both Maghrebi soldiers as well as Black soldiers. So it's not maybe necessarily calling out just Sub-Saharan Africans, but rather this is a way of probably addressing anyone who's just not white in the French military. There are recorded instances of cadres pointing out North Africans specifically, or Linh Bac Phi in their reporting, but rarely were Sub-Saharan soldiers given this distinction, except in cases where they were identified as all being Senegalese, or simply Zaden, black-skinned. Now, what's interesting here about this kind of use of Senegalese as a catch-all for Sub-Saharan African soldiers is that actually maps on very much to a long-standing tradition in the French military of pretty much referencing any Sub-Saharan infantryman as a tirailleur Senegalais, a Senegalese rifleman. And that is in some parts linked to the history of infantrymen coming from Senegal, but in reality, you have individuals who are coming from Mali, from Senegal, from Burkina Faso, from Chad, and from other Central Africa, what would today be the Central African Republic. Anyway, this is kind of just in many ways, we see a Vietnamese reproduction of how the French are sort of flattening identity in many ways, and we'll come back to how that operates in a bit. So Africans were seen as natural but challenging targets to rally. In one training manual, Vietnamese communists described Africans in racial and unflattering terms. Quote, "Black soldiers are slower. The majority are illiterate, stupid, therefore a bit harder to mobilize them," unquote. And their perceived lack of education posed problems for these campaigns that relied heavily on the printed word, as we just saw. However, the manual assured, quote, if we are patient and smart, we can still enlighten and rally African soldiers as usual. After all, they are in the same boat as us, unquote. So it was this central idea that African soldiers as colonized subjects and members of the peasant and working classes shared common cause with Vietnamese communists that inspired efforts to rally them. But for the Vietnamese, African soldiers had to be shown the way. And we'll touch on a little bit of this sort of maybe what we might call a sort of revolutionary civilizing mission a little bit later, but this sort of vanguard revolutionary mentality is important as part of this overall dynamic. So while cadres noted that some North Africans rallied on their own, swayed in part by the rising tide of militant nationalism in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, not all African soldiers seemed so inspired. Many remained loyal to the French because, in the words of one Dick Van report, quote, Africans still bear the slave mindset, unquote. It was thus the implicit duty of Vietnamese communists to liberate African soldiers from such a mentality. But how successful were they? DRV sources offer a total of 341 individuals from, quote, Africa and other colonized countries, unquote, as having rallied to their side. By their own admission, communist cadres were not as successful as they would have liked. As one report admitted, quote, the African bloc has not shown a sign of leaning towards us, unquote. While communication always remained a problem, this was solved, as I mentioned earlier, by enlisting rallied soldiers to translate propaganda. A larger issue was an inability, perhaps, to understand the cultural differences among France's colonial soldiers. This perhaps led one report to lament that the Dick Van service's underperformance was because cadres did not, quote, understand the psyche of African soldiers, unquote. The belief that Africans ought naturally be the allies of the Vietnamese may very well have prevented Dick Van cadres from truly understanding the enemy they hoped to convince. If Africans did not rally, cadres believed it was because they were not communicating clearly enough, or simply because, in the words of one report, quote, Africa is still oppressed, unquote. But such thinking denied African soldiers the agency to have made decisions for themselves as to whether or not they wanted to serve in the French military. Many Vietnamese communists were convinced that Africans had been tricked into service or were only doing it for the pay. But in reality, North and Sub-Saharan African soldiers were far from colonial mercenaries. They enlisted for a variety of reasons. And this idea is actually quite widespread, this idea of, and it's a bit delicate to kind of parse, because not only do we have this kind of rhetoric of, you know, these soldiers, they've just been tricked by the French, they're just doing it for the money. That obviously comes from Vietnamese sources, but we have a lot of former veterans who will say more or less the same thing. And that's not to discount perhaps their own lived experiences, but I think when we're talking about the sort of, how do I want to put this? In terms of kind of looking back on those experiences, it becomes a very easy way to justify service in a colonial military by simply saying, well, I was only, you know what, my heart wasn't in it. I was just doing it for the money, or the French forced me to do it. I think the reality is a little bit more nuanced. And we'll touch on that just now. Certainly money played a role. I think it's important to realize that the military offered regular and reliable pay, and therefore financial stability, which is a rarity for many indigenous men in France's colonies. A 4-year engagement for a North African soldier paid 6,500 French francs a month. That's a lot of money. But military service offered more. A chance to break free from the strictures of rural life and the control of domineering local notables. It gave social independence from traditional cultural and religious obligations. It gave the dignity of uniform, rank, and responsibility, and the chance for upward mobility and social advancement in a colonial society that made both of these things difficult for indigenous populations. And lastly, a sense of adventure that appealed to particular masculine sensibilities, I think it should be noted. Moreover, many North and Sub-Saharan Africans came from societies that still valued, if only symbolically, those men who undertook the feat of arms. And they often hailed from families or communities in which older generations had fought for the French since the 19th century, participating both in wars of imperial conquest overseas and in France itself during the First and Second World Wars. Military service was therefore not an aberration, but rather a tradition for many African soldiers. As historians like Gregory Mann have shown, veterans in Senegal and Mali formed potent political blocs in their colonies, and their service provided an example for younger generations to emulate. Lastly, many colonial subjects, for better or for worse, still placed their faith in the French Empire, even despite a recent history of bloody colonial repression, such as the Tiaroa massacre in Senegal in December 1944, or the Sétif massacre in Algeria on May 8, 1945. The newly constituted Union Française held out the promise of reform, an imperial federation that historians like Frederick Cooper have shown was more serious, more robust, and perhaps more attractive than previously thought, especially in French, West, and Equatorial Africa. African soldiers also held diverse ideas of what defined service, bravery, loyalty, and honor. For example, some sub-Saharan soldiers saw desertion as an act of cowardliness, while others saw it as a sign of bravery. So it's important to note here the nuances. Yet, by flattening African identity, Vietnamese communists may have, rather ironically, missed an opportunity to reach African soldiers on their own terms. Nonetheless, those Africans who did decide to rally often decided to stay in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam after the war ended in the summer of 1954. Not merely limiting its efforts to propaganda, the Dic Văn Bureau also assumed responsibility for those who rallied to the Việt Minh, running the camps where they were housed during the war and overseeing those who stayed in North Vietnam after the conflict ended, assuming responsibility over their livelihoods, their housing, and their employment. By the summer of 1955, 279 African soldiers remained in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and as I said, they were christened, of course, as New Vietnamese People, a label that actually applied to all the foreigners who joined the DRV cause, it should be noted. But here, I just want to point out on the right-hand side of the screen, you actually have a list that was drawn up, and I believe the date says on there, the date is wrong. I think it says 1955, but it probably should be 1954. I think that's just a historical typo, just given the fact that this list was clearly compiled after the war. But what we have here is quite extraordinary. We've got the names of many of the soldiers who defected, where they defected, when they defected, their units that they were part of, and their rank. So really a lot of fertile ground to do like a cool social history of those who had defected. And that is actually sort of the hope of some future research that I want to do. On the left-hand side, you've got a photograph taken after the war of some North African soldiers along with their Vietnamese families and some of the Vietnamese workers in this cooperative farm that they were at, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So until the 1960s, most African soldiers resided at a former internment camp where they had been housed during the war when they defected, and that after the war was transformed into an agricultural cooperative in the village of Ba Vi, which is located about 55 kilometers to the east of Hanoi. Officials provided African soldiers with fixed salaries and bungalows in which they could live, often with their Vietnamese wives and their mixed-race children. Ba Vi was even appointed with its own triple-arched North African-inspired traditional village gate, which actually remains standing to this day and is locally known as the Moroccan Gate. If you can see here, this is actually a photo that was taken relatively recently when Ken Min and I actually did a field trip out to Ba Vi. And Ba Vi, of course, is a more modern village now, but the kind of core of it are all of these former bungalows that had been used to house these African soldiers, and now Vietnamese families live in them. And this arch that you see is actually just plopped in the middle of some person's backyard. It looks quite fresh and restored, and that is because the Moroccan embassy in Hanoi has kind of taken it upon itself to be the custodian of this arch, and will every few years provide money for its upkeep. It's kind of interesting how Morocco has sort of latched on. In reality, of course, you had soldiers from all of North Africa who were present, and some people believe that it was just Moroccans who might have been in Babi. I think if we look at the numbers, there are probably more Algerians than Moroccans who were there. Now, by the beginning of 1955, the DRV started putting their new Vietnamese comrades to work. African soldiers harvested rice in paddy fields, labored in coal mines, milked cows, and raised goats, or worked to repair the many bridges, roads, and railways of northern Vietnam devastated by war. Another quick aside, I've heard that Ba Vi is relatively known for its dairy production, particularly its yogurt. And I think there's good evidence to suggest that that yogurt production is actually directly linked to the fact that you had North African soldiers who were there making the yogurt, because I don't believe that is necessarily a kind of traditional Vietnamese delicacy. And goats were brought in. We have evidence that goats were brought in specifically to this farm so that North Africans could kind of raise an animal that they were used to using, and that they could, of course, also use for religious purposes, for aid, for example, for slaughtering a goat for Muslim holidays and things like that. So despite being provided employment and accommodation and goats, many new Vietnamese were frustrated by their situation in the Democratic Republic. They resented being confined to designated villages and bristled at doing manual labor when many of them had technical skills that they could put to good use, technical skills, ironically, that they had learned in the French military. Constant supervision by military authorities and requirements to take political education further provoked anxiety that they might never live as normal civilians. Many demanded improvements in their living situation, and one group of African coal miners even went so far as to draw up a list of ambitious proposals to address many of their complaints. Among them was a desire to be given the freedom to spend their salary as they pleased, to be issued identification cards so that they could, quote, freely circulate like all other Vietnamese workers, unquote, to marry Vietnamese women according to Vietnamese law, to be given jobs that aligned with their pre-war occupations, and perhaps most telling of all, to participate in the DRV labor unions and have, quote, the possibility to enter the Vietnamese Workers' Party, unquote, or as the petition writers made clear, quote, in a word, to actively take part in the political life of the country, unquote. Such a list of demands suggests that these new Vietnamese people truly expected a degree of parity with regular Vietnamese people. The question, however, was to what extent was Hanoi willing to allow foreigners to participate actively in the social, and for that matter, political life of the country? In theory, many of these demands were addressed by a decree issued a few months later by Deputy Prime Minister Pham Van Dong on April 30th, 1955. This legislation ensured residency permits that would be issued to the new Vietnamese and insisted that European African people are protected by the laws of the government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, unquote. DRV policymakers even bestowed the honorary title of Veteran of the People's Army to any defector who had actually fought with the Viet Minh, and subsequently were entitled to certain kinds of pensions and other social entitlements. Notably absent, however, were policies related to political integration, such as eligibility for party membership, or most importantly, citizenship. But these demands for parity worked in both directions. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam expected the new Vietnamese to behave like any other Vietnamese. And like any other Vietnamese, that meant accepting the authority of the party state, tolerating the omnipresence of its cadres, following its decrees, participating in its mobilization campaigns, conforming to certain expectations of moral temperament, and undergoing political education when such expectations were not met. Certain cadres saw these soldiers as potential vectors of Western subversiveness, and the Dick Van Bureau compiled dossiers, such as the one you see on the left here, to track ideological progress, disciplinary issues, and work. Africans may have wanted equal treatment in some regards, but not in others. Their demands for parity often conflicted with their requests to be treated differently than the Vietnamese, partly because they were different culturally, religiously, and ethnically, and partly because they saw themselves as having made a great sacrifice by defecting, and in so doing, abandoning their homes and betraying the French Union. Rightly or wrongly, many felt entitled to special recognition at a moment when the nascent DRV had little to give its own citizens, never mind a motley assortment of foreigners who regularly complained about the jobs they were given, the money they were allocated, and the regulations they were obliged to follow. It is worth remembering that the new Vietnamese found themselves residents of a state that was undergoing massive and uncertain transformations. In the wake of the war, the DRV needed to extend and solidify its own sovereignty over territory and populations that until very recently had been administered by the French. The pressures of reconstruction and land reform, coupled with mounting anxiety over the future of unification as American foreign aid flowed into a newly emergent Republic of Vietnam, all conspired to foment tensions between Vietnamese, new, and old. As one Dick Van Bureau report from June 1955 admits, there was significant prejudice, or tan kin is the word that's used in the report, toward the new Vietnamese, especially in the labor sector. Supervisors at the state-run mines, factories, and railways were reticent to take on Africans because they were seen as, quote, a complicated sort, whose tendency to challenge convention was irksome. Managers perceived foreigners as, quote, an obstacle to the work at factories because defectors frequently question, make demands, and annoy them, unquote. Since many North and Sub-Saharan Africans could not speak fluent Vietnamese, they often required the presence of a Dick Van cadre who spoke some French to act as an interpreter at job sites, thus slowing work and increasing the likelihood of miscommunication that could affect production quotas. The new Vietnamese were seen as being, quote, rowdy, bagay, lazy, and stubborn, and the Dick Van Bureau lamented that many were harshly disciplined for, quote, trivial misconduct, like playing cards together. In a few extreme instances, such as in the mines of Tuan Quang and Thanh Nguyen provinces, Vietnamese supervisors physically abused their African laborers, and there's some evidence of this in Dick Van reports. Moreover, despite the fact that all the new Vietnamese had rallied to the Viet Minh during the war, the Dick Van reports that many Vietnamese still held the past service of the tirailleurs in the French Expeditionary Corps against them. Some overseers even feared that African workers, quote, will destroy the machines and destroy the factories, unquote. Whether out of malice or incompetence is unclear in that regard. Consequently, many directors of state-run projects saw the new Vietnamese as more trouble than they were worth, and often asked the Dick Van Bureau to relocate them to have, quote, peace of mind. Given such casual suspicion and occasional contempt, it is not surprising that morale declined amongst African soldiers. Some Africans suffered from homesickness and began questioning their place in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Much to the chagrin of DRV cadres, some even began asking to return to the very empire they had abandoned. Nonetheless, Hanoi remained committed to ensuring that its European and African residents would stay. As in wartime, Vietnamese communists felt a sense of paternalistic responsibility toward their African brothers to reform and enlighten them so that they could, quote, take care of their lives, unquote, and work happily, all while, quote, correcting the warped ideologies and behaviors, unquote, that inhibited their integration as members of the new socialist society. But keeping Africans in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam had even larger ideological implications. Africans' futures were linked to that of the DRV, I would argue. Their struggles were one and the same. Convincing Africans that a life in North Vietnam was worthwhile would therefore be a testament to the power of Vietnamese communism itself. Returning them would be an admission of failure, not just in their power to persuade, but perhaps, the fear was, in the very political philosophy their persuasion promoted. No matter how troublesome African workers might be to the authorities, releasing them back to the French would be an admission of defeat against an enemy they had just vanquished on the battlefield. As one report reasoned, keeping Africans in Vietnam was necessary to, quote, retain political impact, unquote. But doing so meant an often fraught commitment to integrating them. It would also mean, somewhat ironically, that the new Vietnamese were fated to remain in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, where they would participate in Vietnam's ongoing internal revolution rather than ones brewing in their homelands. Only when the clouds of war once more threatened Vietnam in the mid-1960s did many of the Algerians, Tunisians, Moroccans, Senegalese, and Malians who had built their lives in North Vietnam return to their homelands, now newly independent countries constructed without their assistance. All right, so by way of conclusion, drawing attention to these efforts of Vietnamese communists to vie for the loyalty of African soldiers and mobilize them to their cause, this research that I presented today hopes to make a few interventions. Firstly, for the purpose of this talk, to recenter the experiences of African soldiers and de-exceptionalize the Indochina War as a war that occurred solely between the Vietnamese and the French. In so doing, we can recuperate, re-emphasize, and re-examine the role that non-white soldiers from France's colonies played in the conflict, and understand that the Indochina War was an intercolonial conflict that would have important reverberations and through lines to national liberation movements and wars of decolonization in Africa. Such a focus can help us reconsider the historiography of the war itself. The First Indochina War was not one conflict, but several: a colonial war, a war of independence, a civil war, a proxy of the Cold War, and a battle for different expressions of sovereignty. But by centering the experiences of African soldiers, I'd like to argue that we should reframe the conflict as a contest between two competing possibilities for post-war internationalism and leadership of the Global South. On the one hand, the promise of renewed imperial federation under the Fourth Republic's French Union, and on the other, of global anti-colonial solidarity spearheaded by vanguard Vietnamese communism. The so-called choice African soldiers would make would in some way validate one side or the other, a small part of a larger struggle to reframe the world after 1945. Examining the case of African soldiers allows us to overlay issues of race and identity onto the conflict in a way we rarely consider. What happens when the revolutionaries take on a civilizing mission all their own? In the end, Dikvan cadres were limited by their own ideological worldview, one that strove valiantly to defeat the corrupting effects of empire, but one which could not look beyond it to understand how better to engage with a diverse population of foreigners who spoke different languages, practiced different faiths, and possessed different values and customs. The remedy for behavior that ran counter to the expectations of Vietnamese communists was often more exposure to the, quote, right ideas. This reliance on political instruction would compel many African soldiers to try to return home. Reticent to admit that their methods were not succeeding and reluctant to send Africans back to territory still controlled by the French, the Dikvan Bureau committed itself to settling Africans into a more permanent life in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, but only to a certain degree. As the new state weathered the tumult of the early post-war years, Africans were kept apart from wider Vietnamese society in special villages, safely cordoned off in remote areas of northern Vietnam, working on farms, repairing bridges, and mining coal. Few were authorized to even live or work in Hanoi itself, and attempts to enter urban areas were met with anxiety and suspicion. Political participation and party membership were never extended to the new Vietnamese, and none were ever groomed to be cadres for the future organizing they might be expected to carry out when they were returned to their homelands. Instead, these soldiers lived a life in limbo, never fully allowed to integrate into wider Vietnamese society, and not permitted, either by circumstance or the DRV itself, to return home. This perhaps is not as surprising as it may seem, and reveals a central tension to the story. As we have seen, Vietnamese communists were sensitive to African mindsets. The new Vietnamese had the potential to reform, but they also had the potential to subvert. Prone to question authority, relapse into troublesome behaviors, or slip from government minders, there was an implicit fear that African soldiers might serve as vectors for the very corrupting influences that Vietnamese communists were working hard to abolish in their own population. Hanoi preferred to have its African brothers close enough to keep an eye on them, but not much closer. In the end, it would seem that Noi Vietnam Moi was little more than a label that, much like Dic Văn propaganda in wartime, held out a promise that was never fully realized. It signaled an ambitious, if ambiguous, aspiration to nurture and promote a global fight for national liberation in the Vietnamese mold. That project became firmly rooted on Vietnamese soil, and African soldiers became avatars for the world outside that Vietnamese communists sought to change. If the role, I should say, of France's African soldiers are remembered at all today in Vietnam, it is how the Dic Văn Bureau would have liked to have seen them, anti-colonial allies in the struggle to remake the world at a moment when the Democratic Republic of Vietnam looked to be accelerating the tempo of history. But the harsher reality of this history allows us a through line to interrogate contemporary issues about race and identity in Vietnam today, and question the ways in which a Vietnamese society that is regularly perceived as producing migrants who must struggle with assimilation abroad must also come to terms with the dynamics of immigration, belonging, and civic participation at home. All right, thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions and continuing the discussion in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that really wonderful talk. I think, I've listened to some versions and I've talked with you about this. I think many of our students are aware to some extent, and some of the faculty are aware to some extent of this work, but it's really nice to see how much you've updated, how much you've added, and congratulations also to Khánh Minh for your wonderful work in support of this. I definitely say that your joint work together on this project demonstrates one of the greatest strengths of Fulbright University Vietnam in the close relationships and apprenticeship that many students find with our faculty. So it's a really, really great example, and I'm glad that that you presented this, I believe, at the Association of Asian Studies recently. Probably not, you're not going to get the same amount of time there, but so it's also really, really nice to get to see this exclusive, director's cut version of it as well. Okay, so I will use my prerogative as the chair for tonight to also begin with some questions. First of all, you mentioned that the Moroccan embassy has taken upon itself to sort of be a guardian for that gate, and I assume that at the time the newly emerging countries of North Africa would have also been having embassies here in Hanoi. I'm not sure how quickly they were set up. Maybe you can enlighten us a bit more on that process, and to what extent they were petitioned, to what extent did they have any sort of interactions, even if without an embassy, then to what extent do the governments, right, care about these guys, or does anyone ever raise issues with or wanting them to come back, or at least like allowing them to come back if they wanted to come back, right? So I think that's one thing. I think the second is just a much broader question to even further connect this work to the present day Vietnam and its interactions with Africa, and also its ideas of self and citizenship. So, Vietnam today is starting to become one of the bigger investors in Africa. You may not hear the story that often, but it's quite true. I think last year I just read a report that Viettel's investments in Africa grew by about 30-something%, right? So it's definitely revving up, and especially in 5G infrastructure, right? So and one of you remember well, I'll not mention her name, but I have also someone else in mind who's been working also on Vietnamese sex workers who have been who have been coming to Africa, and it's a significant number to some of these East African countries, right? And meanwhile, there are also African players now in Vietnamese Football League and so on, right? So I guess in a way, does this much earlier history in some way have echoes in the ways that Vietnam today, is still imagining Africa in this relationship, which is not, one of the most talked about relationship. Are there parallels perhaps in some of these historical dynamic interactions with ones today, and also, what do you think about this struggle of at the time, even though they're not slated to be Communist Party members, they were given citizenship, right? Which is extremely rare today. That it's not equal citizenships, but it's some sort of citizenship, right?
Sorry, who was given citizenship? You're saying?
Sorry, were these soldiers, were they given Vietnamese citizenship?
No, they
okay,
weren't.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that was a notable aspect of it.
I see, but you still call it the new Vietnamese in a way. So yeah, I think that's the okay, to join with the Viet Minh, but I see. Okay.
There's a lot of rhetoric, but maybe not a lot of follow-up.
I see. Okay, so let's scratch that last one. But yeah, I think that's plenty enough to get us started. And then please, the audience, please feel free to write your questions in the chat, or also to raise your hands, and I'll make sure to call on you. Thanks.
Do we want to take a few more questions, or should I take them one by one? What's your preference, Juan?
I think you can start with those two, and then people will have a bit of time to think and also write in the chat as well. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. So the diplomatic question, both at the time and then today, is a very fascinating one. And I've had some interaction with this personally, because in the course of doing research in Hanoi, I had the opportunity to actually meet with the Algerian ambassador to Vietnam, and was able to speak with him, mainly to see if actually the embassy had any sort of holdings or information about this repatriation process that would have happened in the 1960s or 1970s, and that most of the African soldiers were discussing would have gone back around then. Once there's kind of large-scale U.S. aerial bombardment of North Vietnam from 1965 onwards, the DRV can't really assure the safety of these men and their families anymore. They move them from Ba Vi, I think up north towards Yen Bai, to try to get them out of the immediate vicinity of the capital. But the war comes most places, and by this time, many of the colonies are now independent countries, so they have a place to go to that doesn't involve necessarily having to go through the French authorities to get back home. And many of them do. And many of them move with their Vietnamese wives and their children. So I think there's actually an interesting kind of, the diplomacy goes both ways, because not only would you have the establishment of new embassies in North Vietnam from the early 1960s onwards, the People's Democratic Republic of Algeria is one of the first, unsurprisingly. There is, of course, a rather substantial rhetorical link, if not material one, between the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN, the National Liberation Front, that's fighting the French in Algeria. In fact, I think the FLN even has its own soccer team, football team that they send to North Vietnam at some point during the war to play a friendly match. So there's a lot of kind of symbolic connections. Of course, once you have the wives and partners of these soldiers who are going to back home, then you also have, I think, a diplomatic imperative on behalf of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and today, actually, the modern Vietnamese state, to interact with those individuals, some of whom are still alive. They're very old women now, or they're children, actually. At least in one case, I believe, there is the son of a Moroccan soldier who is the subject of documentary that Al Jazeera put together some 5 years ago, I want to say. And he kind of recounts the trouble he's had convincing the Moroccan government to recognize him, because his father actually died in North Vietnam when he was quite young. So there's no paper trail, right? And so again, there's kind of this symbolic rapprochement that can occur, but sometimes the sort of policy elements of that cooperation can be marginalized, because it can be a little awkward sometimes as well. It's worth noting that, of course, even prior to some of the kind of contemporary investment in Africa today by Vietnam, there are these, of course, longstanding connections. Many of the sort of independent leaders that emerge in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in some cases would subsequently become kind of strongmen, they had served in Indochina. And I believe Sean Fear has done some interesting work on the diplomatic relations that the Republic of Vietnam kind of tried to develop during the Vietnam War, in part by sort of finding these connections between Vietnam and, say, the president of Chad, who had been, I believe, a non-commissioned officer in Indochina. And I think, just to maybe sum up, what you're kind of getting at, I think, is a really kind of interesting central conundrum that of the Vietnamese revolutionary experience that I think in part this case study kind of reveals, which is, unlike a lot of other revolutionary societies in the world, Vietnam is definitely considered sort of a vanguard revolutionary state. But unlike, say, an Algeria or a Cuba, it doesn't become sort of a meeting place or a crossroads of revolutionaries. It doesn't, in the words of Jeffrey Byrne, who writes about Algeria, who calls it the Mecca of revolution, right? In which you've got people like Nelson Mandela of the Black Panthers, who are hanging out in Algiers in the 1960s and 1970s. That doesn't happen in Vietnam. Now, granted, North Vietnam is in kind of a war footing, but it seems sort of like a missed opportunity, and that we kind of glimpse this other potential future that could have been, that is to say, a Democratic Republic of Vietnam that was kind of open to the revolutionaries of the world, that was actively trying to promote and export revolution. And we actually don't see that happen. It will export rhetoric. It will even export arms. It sends weapons to the FLN, for example. But it doesn't sort of become this safe haven, even after the war. It doesn't. And yet Vietnam does trade on kind of its revolutionary currency today, which I think does make it a compelling partner for a lot of countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, as we see, like the current governments of Mali and Burkina Faso, who have been very militant in pushing and marginalizing out the sort of artifacts of French military and economic power and replacing them, perhaps awkwardly, with Russian influence. But I think that just goes to show, I think, a demand for alternatives. And this sort of legacy is one that Vietnam has, can be one. And it doesn't surprise me that if you had a choice of, Orange, France Telecom, or Viettel to set up your 5G, you might choose Vietnam.
Yeah, and I mean, just more to that point also, I just want to say, like, my great uncle, spent 10 years as a doctor in Algeria. No, it's not Algeria, Angola. Yeah, and the Vietnamese did actually send aid in the 1970s and 80s once the war was over to some of these countries as well. And today, of course, Vietnamese troops boots are on the ground in South Sudan as Blue Berets. So there is that amazing legacy. But okay, there are many amazing questions in the chat. I think, Andrew, maybe you can just read them yourself, right? And
yes.
maybe just answer them in order. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I'll take them. So looking at the first one from LT, there's a quick question about what are the attitudes and policies to the African soldiers when they return to their homeland. So this is an interesting one and kind of follows on from Hong's question, which is, I don't really know. There seems to be a lot of silence. And, this is a slightly older generation. Many of them are dying or have passed away already. I have an ambition kind of as a follow-on to the research I've done in Vietnam, and is to go to return to Algeria, where I did my dissertation research, and interview veterans who might still be alive, or to places within sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to Martinique in 2 weeks to present at the French Colonial Historical Society conference, and I'm actually hoping to pair that with some potentially do some interviews with veterans from France, Fanon, and Somme Islands. So we'll see. My sense is that it's kind of a lost connection. And that just is probably because in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Vietnam had more pressing matters to attend to, and these individuals were kind of getting settled back. But I haven't seen any evidence of, say, individuals who want to kind of come back, right, and kind of see what it was like. The sort of kind of veteran tourism that we'll see with USGIs, for example, I haven't seen that. And that's probably just because it would be incredibly hard and difficult for individuals from some of these countries to travel or get the permissions to enter Vietnam, for example. I know occasionally sort of Vietnamese media will highlight kind of more well-known defectors, but for the most part, they've tended to be white Europeans who have been the focus of sort of media interviews and these sorts of things. All right, Mark, your question is, were the Noi Vietnamese all recruited from the French Empire or Union, or did the DRV actively try recruiting oppressed people from elsewhere? More specifically, I know the Soviet Union courted Angela Davis, while the PRC courted the Black Panthers. At some point, does the DRV begin appealing to African Americans? Yeah, so that's also a great question. As far as this term Noi Vietnamese is rather extensive. It does include some other kinds of individuals who are hanging around in Vietnam after the immediate end of the Second World War. So in particular, you've got, I mean, this period makes for some strange bedfellows. You've got former soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, these guys who are like, I'm never surrendering, who totally flip sides, join the Viet Minh, and are like, all right, I'm going to fight with you now. They're considered to be Noi Vietnamese. Also, there are some, I think, like Chinese nationalist soldiers who get mixed up in this as well, who are kind of like, yeah, I don't want to go back, or they're hanging out mainly in the northern part of Vietnam, who sort of decide that they're going to join the cause. But you don't really see, at least during the first Indochina War, recruiting efforts beyond the battlefield, as it were. And honestly, if we're being rather up front, the biggest concern for Vietnamese communists is actually not recruiting French soldiers or African soldiers. It's recruiting Vietnamese soldiers who are fighting with the associated state of Vietnam. And I would say that there's a whole even more impressive Dic Văn effort in order to persuade those soldiers that they need to join with their brothers, their Vietnamese brothers, and fight the French. During the sort of Second Indochina War itself, this sort of effort to propagandize the enemy rises up again, and African Americans are targeted. But my sense is, just like with the French experience, it is not very successful. So despite there being a lot of rhetoric and seemingly really fertile ground to recruit individuals, I mean, this is a point in time in which you've got civil rights activists saying, no Vietnamese person has ever called me the N-word. There is cognizance in American society of what is going on and the way that Black Americans are going to be used by the military. And yet there are very few defections. I think there's like a handful of famous cases, not even as many Americans who will defect for ideological reasons to North Korea, which is an interesting parallel that I want to sort of draw out in the future. All right, from Xavier, and hello, welcome. I'm so glad you could make it. Your question is, were there any talks regarding defectors between the FLN and the Viet Minh after the Algerian War started between 1954 and 1962? So this question is kind of central to what got me started. As someone who works mainly on French North Africa in the past, I kind of want to know, like, was there an actual through line? It kind of feels right that you would have had soldiers fighting, Algerians fighting in the French military, who maybe many of those who got captured at Dien Bien Phu, who would have been radicalized during their experience and would have gone back. And they're the reason that kind of the Algerian Revolution kicks off. And part of this research was, in fact, meant to sort of prove that or disprove that one way or the other. I haven't quite cracked it. It's quite clear that the FLN, a lot of the guys involved in the sort of the original 7, some of them are veterans of the Second World War, but they're busy being politically active, and they're in Algeria, right? They haven't been sent to Indochina. So I think is more likely is sort of once the FLN sort of kicks off its revolution and it starts to gather steam, a lot of returning veterans might have a choice to make. Are they going to re-enlist with the French military, the Harki, and many they'll stay loyal to the French, or will they sort of like return to civilian life and then take up arms with the FLN? And I'll be honest, I've interviewed FLN veterans for my first project, and it's a touchy subject because everyone wants to be, and if you're talking to people who might have older relatives who were in the military, everyone wants to be like, oh yes, it was my grandfather, the Mujahideen, the Mujahid, not my grandfather who was also the NCO in Indochina. But in reality, these people could be both one and the same. And it's just, I think, a question of sort of pulling that out. What is interesting is when the FLN delegation goes to North Vietnam, I want to say around 1956 or 1957, there's a request by a lot of these Algerian guys to say, hey, can we meet with the FLN? And from what I can tell, they're denied, or it's very limited, the interactions that they have, which I find to be very surprising, actually, is I think there might have been some form of visit, but I don't know the extent to which the FLN was working on trying to get those guys to come back at that moment, or even if the Vietnamese government would have wanted to release them. And I'll be frank, I think that could be a really sort of touchy subject for both Algerians and Vietnamese to kind of unpack, but it's worth unpacking, I think. All right, and then I just want to make sure we're good on time. We've got about 10 minutes left. So Hua, few questions. As the Africans joined the military for various reasons, how did the Viet Minh psychological warfare, particularly the call for fighting against the French colonists, resonate with them? And two, as a DRV had different perceptions towards the African and Vietnamese that fought for the French, can you share some insight into the DRV's policies towards those Vietnamese? Right. So for the first question, these, for the most part, African soldiers are joining almost from the very beginning. The first arrivals of soldiers coming from mainly North Africa at first happened in 1947. And they arrive a little bit later than the French would like because they have to stop off in Madagascar to put down an uprising that's happening there at the same time. So before they even get to Indochina, they're being employed in the service of in repressing independence movements. But I think the Vietnamese realize immediately, Vietnamese Communists, I should say, recognize immediately that there is an opportunity here. And Kang Min and I had the opportunity to interview a very old gentleman right now at the moment, Mr. Hugh Nop, who is, I think, better known to many people in Vietnam as like a Vietnamese cultural commentator. But in his youth, he was in charge of Dic Văn efforts for colonial soldiers in particular. And he shared with us sort of like, from the very beginning, even before a lot of the Dic Văn efforts got standardized, that there would be sort of propaganda newsletters that would be distributed and slipped under doors and passed around, written in French, in an effort to try to awaken the anti-colonial sentiments of these soldiers. The question is, one of these, again, compared to the overall numbers of African soldiers who served in Indochina, very small minority actually defected. So this question of resonance is a difficult one to parse, because maybe some may have felt that, this reasoning was correct, but they just weren't in a position to take action, or they weren't convinced by it. But, we have enough. I think the biggest factor here is actually the perceived threat that the French had of these efforts, because concurrent to sort of Vietnamese propagandizing efforts, the French develop their own forms of kind of psychological warfare prophylactics in an effort to sort of protect the mentalities of their soldiers, because they also have this perception that the African soldiers are going to be swayed. And so they double down on reform efforts to try to, provide entertainment and morale boosting activities for these soldiers. And they create what they call a Bureau des Affaires Musulmanes and a Bureau des Affaires Africaines. So Office of Muslim Affairs and an Office of African Affairs, whose sole job was to monitor the morale and the susceptibility of these soldiers. So really, I think these efforts, the biggest effect they had was on sort of the anxieties that the French harbored themselves about using these soldiers. As for your second question, that material certainly exists. I haven't looked at it, so I can't tell you the way in which it is similar or maybe differs. But from some of the material that Kang Min and I looked at, because often within the Dic Văn manual, you've got like, this is how you do German soldiers, this is how you do African soldiers, and this is how you do Vietnamese soldiers. We get a flavor of kind of like, what are the ways they wanted to appeal to everybody. And in many cases, one of the things I remember from going through these sources was just kind of the fact that Vietnamese soldiers, although they use the term "Nguyen Binh" puppet soldiers, there's a fair amount of understanding, at least in the early Dic Văn material, to say like, hey, these guys are not inherently bad. They're not our enemy. They are brothers that need to be kind of reoriented towards our cause, and we need to treat them well, right? To actually show them that they should be choosing us and not the French. All right. And then, hold on, I see maybe last question from Nicolas. Let me just read through this real quick. Oh, that's a fascinating point you're making about the Chum, and that's good to know that there's maybe an earlier precedent for this kind of thinking as well. I will say, maybe before getting to your question, what is interesting is sort of one of the question marks around this research is actually finding where some of this racialized thinking is coming from. Like, what is the source of it? You know, I've got some educated guesses that it's probably probably coming from French colonial education and just sort of through osmosis absorbing the rhetoric around hierarchies and things like that. I think it could be connected to maybe, you know, the older tradition of kind of xenophobia within sort of Vietnam and foreigners. I don't really want to get wade into that territory because I actually think that finding the cause for it is not nearly as interesting as sort of discussing, you know, what are the follow-on effects. I think biases within societies are pretty common, right? So it's not surprising that you would have a group of people be wary of another group of people, even if they seem to share the same sort of colonial circumstances, right? All right, so your question is, did I come across any tirailleurs Marocains in Vietnam? No, I haven't, actually. I haven't come across anyone who might even be descended. There's been some talk that there are some individuals who might still be alive. I haven't found any, but if anyone knows of any, if anyone has any leads, then that'd be great. All right, I think I got to everyone's questions. Does anyone have any other questions or comments? I think we have just about 3 minutes remaining.
Going once, going twice, and it's actually absolutely okay if we don't, and you know, we don't go to the very end. To be honest, a lot has been said, and I think it's been all extremely fascinating. Thank you, everyone, for your really thought-provoking questions as well. Thank you in Vietnam, the ones, all of you who stayed up this late on a Thursday evening. I think in one way it's a show of the love that we have for you here, Andrew, and the hope that you'll come back to us very soon in just 1.5 months. And thank you, Andrew, yourself, and people joining us from, you know, the one from France would be probably the most privileged person with the most reasonable time. But if it's from America, then it's a little bit earlier. And I see Phương Anh, I see Andrew, right? So that would be. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today and for supporting this series. It's actually really great that Andrew is now, you know, joining the rank of the faculty at Fulbright who have also spoken for this series. You know, and some of the amazing research in previous episodes of this series have touched on the First Indochina War and its complexities. You may remember Sean McHale and his work on the fracturing of the South. You may remember Sean Fear, who talked about also a Vietnamese African connection. This one was in South Vietnam, right? The search for the lost daughter of the Central African Republic president who had fought in Indochina as a soldier and was sure he had a daughter. Yeah, and also, of course, from Professor Chris Gosha, the very famous historian of Vietnam as well, and in particular of the First Indochina War. So it's going to be really amazing, Andrew, that with this talk, that we can dialogue further on these issues of race and the end of colonialism and new imaginations of Vietnam's place in the revolutionary world, as we talk about the minority ethnic people around Điện Biên Phủ, their role in the Viet Minh victory there, and the aftermath of Khu Tự trị Việt Bắc, of the self-administered zone of the Northwest, and Vietnam's new conception of how to deal with these people who are not King Vietnamese. What place do they have in the revolution? So with that, I think, thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks to IT team, communications team, for also staying with us to this point. And I shall close it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time. See you soon.
Bye. See you next week. Okay. Bye, guys. Thanks, Phong, for ending the stream. Sorry,
bye thầy.
Please, thank you. Or maybe Tuyên can do it. Thanks.